Hi, listeners. This is episode 2 of The Elephant in the Room, the podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Hanson, and I'm very pleased and very excited to inform all of you that we have a special guest for this episode. I have Grace here for an interview, and I strongly believe that her input will be of great value for this podcast. Before I turn the spotlight over to her, though, I do just want to put a quick trigger warning out. This podcast does focus on the concept of sexual assault, and as a survivor myself, I completely understand that this topic holds a lot of weight and can be triggering for people at times. So if at any time during the podcast you feel the need to stop listening, I fully understand. I also want to point out that I will verbally ask the questions during this interview as well. So if there's any aspects that we discuss that may be triggering, you can skip through those questions if need be. My number one priority is obviously to make sure that everybody involved in the podcast, as well as listening to the podcast, feel comfortable and feel supported. So now I would like to hand it over to Grace. Grace, would you mind formally introducing yourself and maybe providing a little background information for our listeners?
I would love to. First, thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm also really excited as I've just recently stepped into the CASA position as the sexual assault advocate on campus at UW-Eau Claire. So my name is Grace Glor, and I've been working in the field for about 6.5-ish years. I know everyone's story about the work and how we got here is very unique, but I think mine falls into more unique potentially. I graduated from UW-Eau Claire, so I am an alum, and I graduated in 2014.
Okay.
And I graduated with a bachelor's of science in kinesiology. And so my minor was communication studies. And it was like 3 weeks before graduation when I was like, oh no, I made a mistake. I had learned so much at that point. And I was like, well, now what? And so what I ended up doing was I served in AmeriCorps as a VISTA, a volunteer in service to AmeriCorps. I graduated and I was just like ready for some change and to explore some of my interests and also some different areas of the country. And so I moved to New Hampshire on a whim, a very small town in New Hampshire. And I served full time as a part of the prevention education team at a domestic and sexual violence crisis center called Turning Points Network. So I served on the education team, and that was prevention education for grades K through 12 and beyond. And I loved it. And so I stayed a little longer, and then I stayed a little longer. And then I was like, this is too far from home. This started as a 1-year commitment. And so I came back to the Eau Claire area because I love it.
Yeah.
It's a great place to be. And at that point, I was working outside of the field, just taking a short break, kind of doing some more self-exploration. And wouldn't you know, it brought me right back to the field. I went through the volunteer advocate training with Family Support Center to be an on-call advocate. And I had 1 shift as a volunteer before I was encouraged to look into their open positions with prevention education. I'm still not to CASA yet at this point. So I did do some work in the Chippewa Valley with primarily high school, middle school. And ultimately, at the very end of 2020, this position became available, and I recognized how much I love working with non-adults. And it's another area for me to get to know the field and to get to know the work and to get to know advocacy on a whole different level. And so here I am. I'm housed on campus and am an employee of Family Support Center. So we are affiliated with the university, but are not one and the same.
Okay.
So in a big old nutshell, that is me. It was an adventure, that's for sure.
Well, I'm so happy that you were able to come and interview with me. I've been looking forward to this for so long. So I guess we can hop right into the questions. How would you define sexual assault?
Yeah, so we'll find that there's a lot of different definitions that fit a lot of different terms. And I wouldn't necessarily say any definition is more right than the other. I think different definitions serve different purposes. But for today's purposes, I think sexual assault is any act that breaks a person's trust or violates their sense of safety and is sexual in nature. And I think also sexual violence in a broader sense definitely includes a lot of those things that are beyond a physical act. And so also I think that it's important to include that this includes forced, but also coerced and manipulated sexual activity. So yeah, I think that mostly covers it.
So on top of that, how would you define consent?
Okay. So consent for me is the golden answer, which is why I loved prevention education so much and why I love talking about consent with middle and high schoolers.
Yeah.
Because consent, if you boil it down, it's an agreement between participants to engage in a sexual activity or activities. And I think there are just some like mandatory pieces of consent that are required for the definition as well. And that is that it should be clear. It should be freely communicated, so free of that manipulation, free of that coercion, reversible, so gives someone the opportunity to change their mind, and most importantly, and fun, enthusiastic. It
Yeah.
should be fun, it should be enthusiastic, and it's an ongoing requirement or conversation. So
Yeah.
I think that it's seemingly there are all these like caveats to consent, but ultimately it's like the most simple.
If a student wanted to report sexual assault, how would they do this? Who would they reach out to first? And how would they go about that?
Mhm. So for answering this, I think it makes sense to really highlight that we're talking about students specifically on campus and who aren't minors, because it's a whole different ballgame if not. So
Right.
college students who are 18 and above have a few options. So first, there are 3 confidential spaces for survivors to share their experience on campus. And so this is just like, we're not even talking about reporting yet. This is just about talking about what happened. CASA, of course, student health services, and counseling services. So you will notice not like any old professor, right? So if you bring it up to a professor, they may have to move forward in that reporting process, whether or not that was part of your intention with sharing. So the hope is that a survivor can, again, talk to anyone on campus and they would be pointed in the direction of CASA, student health services, or counseling services. But we know that this doesn't necessarily happen. We're working on that. If the assault occurred on campus or on Water Street in Eau Claire, that student can report the sexual assault to campus PD, and that would be one place they could go. If the assault occurred elsewhere in the city of Eau Claire, they would report to Eau Claire Police Department. And if the survivor doesn't want to report to law enforcement at all, which I will highlight is totally okay and understandable, and survivors don't report for a million reasons, and they're all very valid, they can still report to the university through the dean's office. And if the perpetrator or the assaulter is also a UW student, a no contact order can be put in place between the two of them, essentially another added layer of protection. So, in a nutshell, again, these processes aren't that quick and simple, but that would be like the starting off point.
If you just wanted to talk about it, not necessarily follow through with reporting the issue too, I think that's something that's really important. That's something I didn't know, so I think that's really helpful.
I think a lot of people have a preconceived idea of what happens when a sexual assault occurs and what necessary steps have to be taken.
Right.
And so, like, I just always encourage folks, CASA is an excellent place, or any domestic sexual violence crisis center is a great place to start off, because they'll be able to give you all of your options
Mhm.
and ultimately let you decide and drive that boat. Whereas if your first stop was calling the police department, it's going already,
Right.
right?
It kind of almost gives the survivor kind of a sense of control over the situation too, instead of just handing it off to the police. They can still kind of be in control of where it goes from there, which I think is really, really important. Kind of going off of that, could they report anonymously if they were to report that they were sexually assaulted?
Unfortunately, no. Ultimately, their name would have to be tied to a report in some way
Okay.
for investigation purposes
Right.
or, yeah, next steps.
If a survivor were to report and say alcohol or other substances were involved during sexual assault, what would be the plan of action? And would there be any sort of repercussions for the survivor in that sense?
This is a really important question because I think, especially for college-aged students, this can be a huge barrier
Right.
for reaching out and getting help. Because if there was alcohol, if there were drugs involved, there's this fear that I could be the one who gets in trouble for it. And I'm really happy to say that when reporting a sexual assault of any kind to the university or to law enforcement, they will not pursue penalizing the victim for any use of drugs or alcohol because it stands in the way of reporting.
If evidence was brought forward of an instance of sexual assault, are there immediate punishments enforced for the accused assailant if they were to identify that person?
So I think it does depend on what kind of evidence we're talking about and things, but usually, however, there is always going to be an investigation or process, which would lead to either a settlement or a hearing at the university level or ongoing scheduled court dates and that legal law enforcement process if reported to a city law enforcement.
Mhm.
So regardless, the process must be finished,
Sure.
if you will, before punishment or consequences of any kind are like doled out. As an advocate who works for, nonprofit that centers victims and survivors, what we really want is just for people to believe victims and survivors.
Right.
The thing is, we also live within these systems like universities or law enforcement and judicial systems that don't necessarily not believe them, but have an obligation to serve both parties. So
Right.
they are not necessarily serving and protecting a victim, but the law that was broken,
Yeah.
and then also the rights of the perpetrator.
There are so many people that may have experienced it or may know somebody that experienced that fear of someone not believing them if they were to come forward. That's scary.
Yeah. And I mean, how many perpetrators out there will just accept and say, yep, I did it? I think why advocates and why crisis centers like Family Support Center and like CASA that provide these services are so vital for victims and survivors.
So I guess we kind of dipped into the legal, pathways, but is the school responsible for explaining the legal rights to the student if legal action were to be taken?
If it was going to the criminal justice system, I don't believe the school has like a responsibility to go through legal rights of the student again, which is why it's so important that an advocate is involved
Right.
and why it's so important that like the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire sees that as an important position and role
Yeah.
and service for students. Because if the university or there's not someone affiliate or housed with the university doing it, it is an important thing to be able to say is happening. So I would say that the school or university may be able to help a survivor navigate that process, but they're not necessarily responsible.
Sure.
And oftentimes an institution won't even know if a student is pursuing legal action because of confidentiality. So unless they bring in or talk to like the dean's office and say, this is something I'm going through, how can you support me? Yeah, I don't think that the university or anyone at the university would even know.
That was the thing that I kind of was thinking about as I was writing up these questions is confidentiality is obviously something that they want to maintain no matter what with any survivor. Are there any available programs at UW-Eau Claire focusing on bystander intervention?
So, keeping in mind that I'm new to the position and I'm ready to explore what prevention efforts are currently being implemented on campus, I actually inquired, but a little bit too late because I haven't heard back yet, the person who was in this position before me about what the university is implementing, because it's interesting because certain funding restrictions will keep me from doing much of that prevention and education work, saying you can only in your position respond to instances or occurrences that have already happened, supporting survivors, in other words. Even though it is where much of my background in the field lies, it's an area that is essentially taken over by the university, if you will. So I'm thinking back to like my freshman orientation, and there was definitely a skit performed about bystander intervention. And I think I did like an online module. So that is like the past. And moving forward, I'm not certain what is happening, especially now in COVID. Like, what does that look like now? So that's on my radar for exploring. But no matter what, I know with a capital K that this is an area that all universities and institutions can improve upon. Given the statistics and given how we know how pervasive these issues are and how often sexual assault happens, especially for college age students. Yeah, I've never been comfortable with any amount, I think, of like education and bystander intervention that's happening on any university.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's kind of also too, I'm trying to look at different reference or sources that talk about other universities, and that's kind of a trend I've seen from other universities saying that, some of the training or the education is not there's room for improvement. And I do remember when you were saying the module that you had to do freshman year, I remember doing the same thing. And I remember a few students that I had heard over talking about it and just saying that they didn't really put much effort into it, and that was kind of disheartening because I think it is something that's super important for people to obviously learn about and be aware of, and I hope that that can improve.
Yeah, certainly. I would encourage people to look into, there's a program that I really believe in called Green Dot. Oh, they might have changed their name actually. But if you Google it, you'll find it. And it was a bystander intervention program that started on college campuses. So it's like specifically tailored for that environment. It's just so good. It's so good.
I guess that should have been another question that I have for you too, because I kind of was thinking more about things on campus, but I'm sure too that there's so many organizations that aren't UWEC affiliated. I'm sure that that's something too that is, I would definitely like to explore more. Regarding on campus, what are all of the available resources that a survivor can go to if they are struggling with the healing process?
So I think like housing related RAs are a great resource. Hall directors are great resources. But when we specifically look at these confidential spaces, so CASA, obviously, counseling services, student health services. And I think beyond that, there are a lot of student clubs tied to the issues. And so not necessarily like a resource for navigating the criminal justice system or for getting a restraining order or but like as it relates to healing and community, I think that there are a lot of opportunities on campus at UW-Eau Claire for engaging with like-minded folks who care about these issues, who want to see these issues end, all of that. So I think like the student clubs, and there are dozens.
I think that that's something too that from my experience too, that it made me feel so much more comfortable being so open about it when I could relate with other people. And, like I felt comfortable telling my close friends and close family, but not all of them had necessarily first-handedly experienced sexual assault. And so they can only empathize and understand to an extent. Whereas being able to talk to somebody else who maybe had gone through something similar or whatever it may be, it is a lot more comforting to know that.
Mm-hmm. And also we're still kind of working out the kinks with COVID, but typically on a typical year, there are support groups facilitated by CASA for victims and survivors. So right on campus, allowing folks who have been impacted by similar things to connect and find that sense of community. So
yeah. How can students on campus become advocates for awareness and prevention of sexual assault?
Yeah, this is like my bread and butter. This is like, I love when people ask these questions because it can feel so daunting. It's like, what can I, a single person, do to help the issue of sexual assault, this giant thing? And it can feel pretty scary. Pushing all of that aside and like simply like talking the talk and walking the walk is your first spot. And so get familiar with the issues, talk about them with the people in your circle of influence. You can start by believing survivors, whether that is the news story that you see or your friend or a friend of a friend who shares with you, recognizing if those thoughts, like victim blaming thoughts or other problematic things that we've kind of been like socialized to accept, creep in. So I think really getting familiar with you and your beliefs is like where to start. And you don't need to do more than like show up and begin, like, I hate using the word journey, but journey, attending events and going to learning opportunities, being active bystanders when you're out and about. So if you see something problematic, check in with someone. You want to walk with us to back to campus? Like, we're headed this way. Engaging in tough conversations with friends, especially if you're a student athlete or you're involved in Greek life or other leadership groups. Volunteer, exclamation point. So we certainly do take on volunteers. Family Support Center, which is like our mother agency again. Like I mentioned in my kind of experience, I started as that on-call volunteer advocate. It's an excellent training. So if you're like, I don't know what to do, like it is by far the best advocacy, getting your feet wet kind of training you can engage in. I truly do believe. Calling out problematic behaviors when they come in to your life, like cat calls, locker room talk, rigid gender stereotypes or gender roles. And then, yeah, as you like go down this path of your journey, going deeper, exploring root causes of violence like racism and systemic oppression. Find a way to communicate that like sexual assault is not okay with you in your everyday life. Like whether that's wearing a t-shirt, putting a bumper sticker on your car, engaging in those active bystander, like whatever it is, like if you can fit it into your everyday life, you're doing it, you know? Some of it is borrowed from Green Dot, I will say, because it is such a good program, but they talk about reactive and proactive. And so like reactive would be like engaging as a bystander, whereas proactive would be having a t-shirt that you wear where people can just like notice and be like, all right, they're on our team.
Okay, and then last question, would you say that this campus is doing a fine job at handling these cases, or do you believe there is room for improvement?
I think there's always room for improvement when we talk about these issues. I think there's always room for improvement when we talk about victims and victims' rights. However, I will say that in my experience in the role, which is limited at this point, I think they're doing a really pretty decent job with reports. I think that victims and survivors are being handled with care. Unfortunately, it's not the university that holds all of the responsibility. And I think that across like our country, across our nation, what's actually happening is that we're dropping the ball completely when it comes to consent and healthy education, healthy relationship education. And knowing that my background is in that kind of work, yeah, it's totally my opinion that high schoolers should not be graduating without a real understanding of what consent is and what it is not. And so, yeah, we see like the failings of this education every week in our roles as advocates. I think the university is doing, yeah, like you asked, they're doing a fine job, but there's always more. And I think the important thing too is that like you can't do that in one 45-minute session.
Yeah.
Like you can't sit a high schooler down and be like, great, we did it.
Yeah.
We understand. It's like weekly conversations for like, there should be a full-on class. And in my work, I've just noticed like youth are thirsty for that information. Like there are very few young people who are like, I'm good.
And even just meeting new people when I came to college. I didn't know a whole lot of people that came from my high school here. So I was, surrounded by a whole new group of people. And I mean, even the people that I've been around and that I've met here at college, they mentioned too, they were like, that's not something that I'm super familiar with and something that I think I want to obviously become more familiar with. And they didn't even really think about it until it started being talked about a lot more. And I think that it is really cool to see that there are other people that are motivated to also educate and learn more about it, because it's obviously it's a big issue, not just on college campuses, but just in society in general. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, which like I always recommend that every college student takes like one gender studies course.
I got to take a women's studies class my freshman year, and I think that that was really, really valuable.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it, you
Yeah,
know?
definitely. Well, again, Grace, thank you so much for taking time to be a part of this. Do you have any other like closing comments you'd like to add?
You can find CASA on Facebook and Instagram. And in person, we are housed in Hibbard, the third floor. So we're 311C. Next semester, you can drop on by. And this semester, if you are needing services or want to connect, yeah, by phone or email, and then we can connect virtually. But yeah, it's been great. It's so nice to hear when people are interested in the work and to see folks who are interested in getting the word out.
That is another episode of the Elephant in the Room podcast. I'm your host, Natalie, signing off.